The stories. This tape from the lake wasn't meant for you. The box of tapes arrived with a smell like wet cardboard and cold metal, which fit the labels scrawled across the top. The handwriting said property of lakeside maintenance, and under that a warning marker in red that felt a little performative. Ria Kovac was 34 and paid by the city to digitize old media back into living memory, which meant long headphones days. She sat in a windowless room behind the reference desk and fed cassettes into a deck that clicked with patient devotion. Her plan for the day was not ambitious, just finish a carton before her lunch sandwich bled through the paper. The incident began when she lifted a cassette from the stack with tape flaking like dandruff across the shell and saw the note. Someone had written this tape from the lake was not meant for you in the same heavy hand that marked the box. She laughed by herself. Then she rubbed the shell with a sleeve and slotted it into the dubbing deck. The first sound was wind on an exposed mic, then a voice with the plain vowels of a person who never moved away from county lines. The man said, "Recording starts now," then counted off time the way divers do when they want witnesses later. The hiss of water followed, with a hollow knock like an oar catching a ladder. Ria tapped a notepad and wrote, "Lake intake, maintenance crew, late summer." She preferred notes to memory because notes never tried to impress anyone. The voice returned with an update that felt almost scripted, and he said the police have cleared the North Shore and no one wants to check the culvert. He added that the marker buoy drifted during last week's storm, which would confuse people using the old map rather than the fresh survey. Ria paused the deck and stared at nothing. Then she wrote, "This is not training audio." She listened again while the deck began to wobble a little, as if it felt nervous. The man on the tape called a second person by name, which Ria wrote as Reed, though it could have been Reed, and asked for a tow line length in the book. Papers rustled in a way that sounded practiced, like they had been rustled for microphones before. The second voice was younger and annoyingly cheerful, and he read a number that did not match a chart Ria remembered from a digitized manual. She looked up the manual in a folder and confirmed the discrepancy while the tape kept turning. The complication grew through small things that did not agree with each other, which is how real messes usually announce themselves. A splash came with no shouting, then a calm description that a scooter had bumped something that was probably a log. Another voice, off mic, said 30 paces northwest from the pier, which would only make sense to people who used sneakers to measure water. Ria paused and wrote, "Witness statements use paces. Training crews do not." Then she tapped the counter and kept the deck running. The tape cut to a later time without warning, and the man spoke in a lower register and said the family brought a photo. He said the deputy discouraged showing it, then added that the mother insisted because she believed the jacket would reflect light underwater. A woman spoke near the mic and asked if the current would push clothing into the reeds, and someone answered with a line that felt rehearsed by memory rather than by training cards. Rhea stopped the deck and stared through the glass into the quiet stacks. Then she wrote, "Reported missing teen in 1998, probable night swim." She did not know that case personally, but people in her building remembered headlines that arrived 2 summers before the county fair built a second gate. She pulled the archive software and typed terms that felt respectful and cautious, then broadened the search when nothing appeared in scanning range. The first hit was a brief that used the phrase after-hours lake access and urged parents to discuss fences, which sounded like a committee report disguised as news. The second hit was a note about a grant for new lights along the East Path, which suggested some officials had learned a lesson. Ria listened while reading because she had learned to keep both rivers running without spilling knowledge between them. The man on the tape said the outflow grate was secured with a chain that lost one link, then spelled the number into the mic. He said a diver named Reed would check under the skimmer in case a current created a pocket. Someone coughed, and the sound carried like a hallway, which told Ria the recording moved indoors for a moment, probably into the pump house. She stopped the deck and called the public safety office through the desk phone because she preferred clean lines when tape started speaking like living people. The clerk transferred her to a sergeant who kept his voice flat, and he told her there had been many training tapes over the years. He said storage procedures were not always followed, then asked which lake facility label appeared on the shell. She read the letters and silence followed. Then he said he would send an email so everything stayed orderly. Rhea saved the audio to a drive with a date and words and wrote a note that asked for retention guidance, which protected her later. While she waited, she listened again and started catching small textures she missed before, like the way reeds snap near a shoreline when pulled straight out of mud. The man described a sneaker with a broken lace loop, and then he reported the make of a lighter found below the pier that matched several described in earlier calls. He kept saying reportedly and according to people on scene, which sounded careful enough to make a person suspicious. The investigation pushed her out of the room and into places that smelled different, which is how she knew it was working. She walked to the old photo and map drawers past the genealogy corner and pulled a laminated lake grid from the early 2000s that showed markers before the storms moved the buoys. The North Shore marker had 3 possible placements depending on survey year, and the tape described a search pattern that matched the oldest one. She wrote that misplacement would pull a sweep away from the culvert by several yards during a clockwise pattern. Rhea checked the dispatch book that the clerk kept for walk-in requests, and she asked for the log around the week she guessed from the grant article. The book was clean where it mattered and messy where it did not, which is how real logs behave when they are used rather than polished. Several calls mentioned a late-night figure seen near the maintenance gate, and one call specified a tall person wearing a reflective vest that did not match city issue. The vest detail caught her attention because people remember shiny things when they feel useless bystanders. She went to the bait shop at the road bend because people who sell minnows remember who buys coffee the morning after an ugly night. The owner was Tamsin Duarte in 58, with a strong memory for weather fronts and weak patience for tourists. When Rhea asked about North Shore nights from a certain summer, Tamsin cut her off and said people still parked on the service road to drink and break bottles. Then she added a name quietly. Tamsin said a park supervisor called Corley used to sit on the hood and lecture kids about life, though nobody asked. The name did not appear in the tape, but small towns prefer a rotating cast in the same old play. Rhea checked a directory in the library office and found a Corley under Parks with a middle initial and a retirement date in 2007. She called the number listed and reached a house sitter who said the man had moved south for better joints, which sounded reasonable. She left no message and wrote a line that asked if Corley ever held keys to the pump house after hours, then underlined it. The deck resumed chewing while she read, and the man on the tape grew more precise, as if he knew the mic would be his memory. He said the grate was clear and the scooter had not found anything new, then asked Reed to try the intake lip again. He added that the mother asked about the jacket again and whether dye would spread from the fabric, which sounded like a thought returned to after anxiety chewed it thin. The woman said she had seen a store video of the jacket that week, which told Rhea the incident had a concrete timeline. Rhea pulled the police scanner archive that the library kept on an old server because nobody could agree on legal disposal, and she searched for mentions of the brand. A scanner summary from late summer of 1998 included a clerk report about a young buyer who paid in coins and smiled at nothing. The same summary mentioned a second caller who said a man in a Parks vest argued with a boy on the east path near the lockbox. The timing lined up with the grant discussion about lights, which tied the city's sudden interest to the noise around the lake. The twist showing itself was not a single aha, because that belongs to movies that need curtains. It was a set of small corners that fit together when pushed with patient hands. Rhea realized the tape sounded like a real-time memory created for someone who was not at the scene, likely a supervisor who needed consistent detail later. The repeated phrases and spelled-out numbers matched how people build an alibi they can safely repeat without emotion. The note on the shell felt like a message to that specific person, a plain way to say, "This is yours and you know why." She rewound the tape to the early mention of the drifted buoy, then she pulled an aerial photo set from the state survey that sat in a drawer. The week after the storms, a maintenance record said the buoy was returned to the older anchor by a small crew without a diver on site. If that were true, the inner sweep of a clockwise pattern would miss the culvert mouth during the first pass, which a clever person might count on. She tried the geometry with a pencil on tracing paper and saw a shallow cone opening exactly where a current would pocket light plastic. Rhea went back to Tamsin and asked if anyone ever found a jacket that fooled a search, and the woman stared a long time. Tamsin said a teen found something pale tangled in reeds the following spring, but the deputy told him to leave it and call. The item was gone when they returned, and the kids stopped talking about it after a meeting with a parks official in a corner booth. Tamsin said she did not like how the official smiled at the end. Then she told Rhea to be careful with old tapes because they roll out like rope in water. She shared a summary with the sergeant by email, using careful words that respected the difference between suspicion and proof. He called rather than write back, which told her he took the summary seriously enough to avoid records for the moment. He said the department had a thin folder with a waterlogged scooter note and a few statements, and he had always believed the sweep pattern was sloppy more than sinister. Rhea said the tape sounded like planned narration for absent ears, and the sergeant stayed quiet long enough to make his thoughts obvious. The payoff finally arrived in the smallest possible way, because people rarely confess in grand gestures when they can do it in shorthand. At minute 40 of the tape, the man lowered his voice and said, "Reed, tell Corley this marker is for the training reel." Then he spelled an odd sequence. It sounded like letters mixed with numbers, which Rhea first took as a buoy code until she remembered a note in the archives about maintenance padlocks. City padlocks used a shared code that changed each spring, and the tape included a similar pattern with 2 digits swapped. She checked padlock logs that were still on paper because privacy rules kept the spreadsheet in another building, and the pattern matched the East Pathlock from that summer. The swapped digits would open the maintenance gate without leaving a standard key entry, which would make late-night arrivals look like routine trips in the morning. The person who needed that information was not a diver or a deputy, but a parks supervisor who liked to sit on hoods and pretend to mentor children. Rhea played the end again and wrote that the tape was a message, not a record of good work under pressure. The line "this tape was not meant for you" was probably aimed at anyone outside a small circle who might later hear it by accident. Corley retired in 2007 with commendations for hours served, which was a different metric from the one that matters in the quiet presence of water. The teen on the Grant timeline vanished from the archive after a few weeks, and the paper changed topics the way papers do when people stop calling. She turned in her notes to the sergeant and asked for a receipt because she understood how institutional memory leaks through cracks when nobody labels boxes. He said he would log the audio as potential evidence, even if the statute road was unclear, and he thanked her for resisting the story-shaped shortcuts. She felt tired in a way that would not fix itself with coffee, and she stopped the deck with her thumb resting on the button longer than needed. On her way home, she pulled into the park and sat in the lot without climbing out. Then she watched a gull bully a sandwich bag. The lake wore its afternoon wind, the way old glass carries waves inside, and she thought about objects that travel farther than people plan. She pictured a jacket catching on a grate, then releasing after weeks. Then she pictured a vest reflecting just right in a corner eye on a dark path. She said nothing to anyone because there was nothing to say that would not become a speech, and speeches never fix water. Later that week, the sergeant called and said the department would reopen a file enough to review procedures from that season. He did not say the word case, and he did not say closure, which she respected. He asked if she would burn a clean copy of the audio with no EQ adjustments, and she said yes because the original was theirs now. She returned to her desk and labeled a disc with careful letters. Then she slid it into an envelope that carried a little static when sealed. She kept one personal note in her drawer that read, "Listen for the words people repeat when they want to be believed." The tape had taught her that patterns are not only for divers and surveyors, but also for liars who fear their own imaginations. She recorded that thought in her daybook and closed it with the last of her calm. Then she put the next cassette in the deck. Someone had written North Dam Inventory on the shell, which sounded refreshingly dull. That night, she drove past the bait shop and waved at Tamsin without stopping. Then she took the long way around toward the public beach. The markers shone without drama, and the path lights hummed with a noise the city would ignore until a budget meeting. Rhea parked by the picnic area and walked to the fence where the service road ended. Then she watched the chain on the gate while cars passed behind her. It had a new lock with a digital face and a sticker that said "City Issue" and nothing more. She returned to her car and wrote one last line on a napkin, so the thought would not echo through sleep and turn into something else. She wrote the tape reached the wrong hands on purpose years later because objects look for the people who will understand them. It was never meant for the public or the paper or the desk with the humming lights. It was meant for a single person who knew a code and loved arrangements. The lake accepted every plan without comment, then it kept its own quiet notes until someone listened with stubborn attention. In the following weeks, the library received a small budget lift earmarked for media preservation, which made Rhea feel both pleased and uneasy. The sergeant stopped by and left 2 donuts that tasted like remorse trying to be kindness, which she appreciated. He said the department had interviewed a few long-retired staff members who remembered a supervisor with a talent for showing up during good photo moments, then leaving before real work began. He did not promise new conclusions, which was the correct move. Rhea finished the carton that started the day, then she shelved the empty box with a clear label that included dates and full words. She had learned to keep history gentle but firm, like a hand holding a shoulder before a hard sentence. She believed the tape would survive now, whether as a footnote or an exhibit or a quiet lesson in training rooms. She believed the jacket probably never reflected enough light to matter, but it had helped a mother keep hold of a shape while others built their own. On a calm morning, weeks later, she sat by the lake with coffee and listened to the small mechanical whir inside her own recorder. She sometimes captured ambient sound to clean her ears between sad projects, and the gulls performed like they were paid in bread. A child laughed from the playground, and a dog shook water from its coat, and the fence creaked with the weight of a sleepy worker leaning to check a latch. Rhea lifted her mic, then lowered it, and decided this moment did not need a track and a label because not every memory belongs to the archive. She drove back to work and unlocked the quiet room. Then she placed the lake tape in a drawer that took 2 keys to open. The message had found an unintended reader, and the circle had widened by an inch, which was sometimes the only ethical way to widen circles. She wrote one careful note in the catalog that said voices describe a search using drifted markers and misremembered charts, reportedly to inform an absent supervisor. The stranger, found in Larch Hollow. Neighbors along the Ridge Road reported a lone man standing in Larch Hollow before dawn, motionless and facing uphill. Mara Keene, 42, forestry technician, entered the ravine after first light to review storm wash and assess slope instability after weekend rain. She carried a handheld GPS and a laminated soils map, and she kept a basic trauma kit near her waist. The county had seen minor slides last winter, and supervisors wanted fresh notes before crews reopened seasonal trails. Her purpose was routine and documented, and she said the air felt colder than the forecast given by local radio. Her field book later recorded a penciled line reading, reportedly still there, written before she claimed she ever saw anyone. Larch Hollow cuts across the eastern shoulder of Coos County, Oregon, where the timber plots crowd a narrow creek that bends twice. Old survey stakes lean at odd angles, and blackberry thickets press against a discontinuous game trail that drops toward the water. In autumn, the alder leaves slick the soil and runoff threads between roots, carrying silt that clouds the creek for hours. Mara knew the turns by sight and sound, and she logged wind direction and a faint diesel odor that never matched nearby traffic. Dispatch logs from the same morning noted no road graders, and state records listed no permitted logging within 3 miles. She reported hearing a human voice near the first dogleg, measured at 40 paces from a flagged snag she had marked last month. The voice was low and even, as if reading from a page that had been folded and kept dry inside a coat. She followed the sound to a pocket of firs that cut the breeze, and she saw a man standing without any gear or pack. He looked around, 50, medium build, clean hands, a button shirt with stitched initials. No one later matched to any business in the county. Some locals claimed such shirts got sold in a church thrift near the bay, but investigators never confirmed the inventory. Mara addressed him as if he were a hiker who had lost the trail, and she kept her tone slow, with her palms open. He did not answer at first, then he said he had come to return a thing he had borrowed, and he glanced downslope. She asked whether he needed help, or water, or a radio call, and he said none of those would help at that hour. Her watch showed 8:17, and she wrote that detail twice, a habit she kept when she worried her timing might be challenged later. Records conflict on whether she then stepped closer or whether the man closed the distance by 2 careful paces. Deputy Saul Redding, 51, County Sheriff's Office, received a welfare call around 8:30, routed through the non-emergency line from a neighbor. Dispatch logs placed him in town refueling, and the drive time to the ridge was 20 minutes if the road stayed dry. He knew the hollow for trespass complaints across 2019 and 2020, usually hunters edging property lines during early fall. He headed out alone, and he radioed a routine field check with no known hazard beyond slick leaves and a soft shoulder. His purpose was to contact any person in distress and to verify no unauthorized vehicles had been left at the upper gate. Mara recorded the man's name as either Laird or Lyle, written with a slant that later complicated forensic enhancement by the lab. She asked for a last name, and he again said he came to return a borrowed thing, then he looked at the creek. His pupils seemed pinned in bright light, though the canopy muted the sun, and his left hand kept 3 fingers pressed to his shirt seam. Reportedly, he asked whether the county still kept the old locker at the maintenance yard, which had once held culvert keys and padlocks. County file from 2009 mentions such a locker by the old bridge yard, though the keys had been replaced several years later. She tried to call it in, but the handheld radio caught only broken carriers, and her phone read emergency calls only with no bars. She moved 3 steps to gain elevation, and the man told her not to climb because the sound would travel in a way the hollow dislikes. She wrote that phrase exactly, and later she told the deputy that the sentence felt memorized, as if learned from another person. Some locals claimed a caretaker used to speak like that when crews closed the creek for culvert work after a flood. Investigators never confirmed the existence of such a caretaker in employment rosters, and state records show seasonal hires with different names. Deputy Redding reached the upper gate at 8:53 and found no vehicle except the county rig and a bicycle with a bent spoke. A laminated trail notice flapped at one staple, and the chain across the spur showed fresh rub where a bumper had kissed it and backed away. He walked the first quarter-mile with his boots scraping wet gravel that held the shape of small hooves and one deep heel print. He radioed his approach and asked any unit nearby to note his time, and the board tagged him green for routine. He did not know about Mara's radio issue until later, and he stated that the hollow always muted signals after rain. Down by the dogleg, Mara stood with the man while the creek stuttered against a culvert that sat half-silted by last week's flow. She asked again what he meant to return, and he said memory travels in objects, and he should not have taken that kind of thing. She did not see any object in his hands, and he avoided looking at her notebook, as if the page itself could unsettle the plan. She asked whether anyone waited for him, and he said someone always waits near water when the season turns toward frost. Records conflict on her next question, but her notes show a line break and a single word reading dresser. The deputy's voice reached them thin and delayed, and the man smiled without showing teeth. Then he lifted his chin toward the upper trail. Mara called back and gave their location with the 2 bends and the flagged snag, and she added the creek noise was rising fast. The man stepped toward the water, and she warned him about the slick bank. Then he told her to listen because a bell would carry. Reportedly, a single metallic strike came from upstream, like a suspended rod hit with a wrench beside running water. The deputy heard nothing from his position, and dispatch logs do not list any equipment operating within that narrow window. Redding found them near the fur pocket, where the creek sounded louder than its width suggested, as if residents lived under the bank. He asked for identification, and the man shook his head. Then he asked whether the locker still existed with its red latch. The deputy answered that county yards kept new lockers now, and old stock had been auctioned or scrapped after an audit 15 years earlier. The man seemed disappointed, and he asked for the year, and Redding answered plain. And Mara wrote that the man looked relieved. Some locals claimed they saw an elderly volunteer in that hollow years ago who checked culverts with a brass key around his neck. The deputy suggested they walk to the trailhead to sort things out, and he offered water and a seat in the rig. The man said he needed to return the borrowed thing first, then he stepped down toward the culvert where water curled and threw pale foam. Redding warned him to stop, and Mara reached for his sleeve, but he raised his hand and said the creek kept the edge steady. He put his fingers into the water and withdrew them clean. Then he set his palm flat against the culvert lip as if matching a shape. Investigators later measured a palm-sized shiny patch there, but lab reports described it as scraped algae with no unusual residue. They walked out together, the deputy leading, Mara behind, the man between them with even steps and steady breath that never turned visible. The ridge showed fog rolling from the marsh, and a low engine throb drifted from the highway before fading without any Doppler shift. Redding said the gate would be closed for a while, and he would give the man a ride to town if no one met them at the top. The man asked whether the school still rang a bell to mark fire drills in early autumn, and he smiled when Mara said, "Not anymore." State records mention the bell had been retired 3 superintendents ago, boxed and cataloged. Location currently unknown, according to a brief. At the rig, the deputy opened the passenger door and asked the man to sit, and he complied without hesitation or visible strain. Mara stood at the hood and wrote timestamps while Redding radioed his status and requested a quick check on missing persons. Dispatch searched the usual lists from neighboring counties and found nothing that matched the rough description or the first name variants. The deputy turned back to the cab, and Mara pointed at the seat where the man had sat a moment earlier. Reportedly, the seat was empty, and the door remained closed, and the gravel showed no fresh print moving away from the vehicle. Redding circled the rig twice and checked under the chassis where mud clung to cooling metal, and he lifted the chain at the gate. He called the hollow by name and asked the man to answer if he had stepped away to the trees for any reason. The creak's sound carried up the spur in distinct pulses, like breath held and released by a patient machine somewhere underground. Mara wrote every word she could recall from the conversation, and she added a note about the locker with the red latch. County file from 2009 again surfaced during the report review, where a photograph showed a red latch on a dented locker door. They returned to the dogleg with care, watching their footing and pausing where leaves gathered as though pulled by weak static. The culvert still sang with water, and the foam showed a trailing loop that repeated at a steady interval against a rock. The deputy touched the lip where the man had placed his palm, and he noted the slick patch felt freshly burnished despite running water. He found no shoe prints distinct enough for casting, and Mara's heel marks had blurred where she had steadied herself near the bank. Records conflict about whether a second metallic strike sounded before they left, since only Mara wrote it and the deputy never heard it. Back in town, they filed a minimal incident report and a longer narrative. Then they tried to trace the stitched initials on the shirt. 2 local laundries reported no marks like that in recent months, and the church thrift logs showed a gap where volunteer notes ended. They checked motels along the highway, and one clerk claimed a quiet man had asked about a room that faced north toward Timber. The dates did not align with the morning in question, and the surveillance camera had been unplugged while a breaker was replaced that week. Investigators never confirmed the sighting, and the name written by Mara yielded no match in any database within the state. Weeks later, a maintenance worker clearing brush near the school found an old bell cradle stored under tarps beside broken desks. The bell itself was missing, and a note taped to the cradle listed a catalog number and an instruction about mounting that no one recognized. A second note mentioned the bridge yard locker inventory and a transfer sheet that had been misplaced during a renovation nearly 14 years earlier. Reportedly, the transfer sheet surfaced in a banker's box at the county archive with a signature that resembled a surname read as Laird or Lyle. State records accepted the sheet as authentic, and the archive logged it without any conclusion that linked it to the hollow. Mara visited the ravine again before winter storms and stood at the culvert while crow calls echoed in the timber to the west. She carried the same laminated soils map, and she placed her palm on the lip where the algae had been scraped to a dull shine. The patch had grown back, and the water ran colder than the air, and a faint diesel odor threaded the turns. She wrote a final line in her field book about a borrowed thing as obligation, then she closed the cover and signed beneath. Her handwriting stayed level and small, and the page included the words reportedly and records conflict and county file from 2009. The deputy kept a copy of the narrative in his desk and underlined each place name, then he drove the ridge one last time in late fall. He listened for any metallic note across the creek, and he measured the echo time by counting aloud between two flat stones. The count never settled, and he recorded inconsistent results on 3 separate visits, despite clear weather and steady flow through the culvert. He concluded the hollow folded sound in ways he could not rely upon for distance, which meant witnesses would always disagree on what carried. His memo went into a folder marked Acoustics Observations, and the case remained open only as a routine contact with no offense. By winter, the story had traveled the county, and some locals claimed they knew the man from a mill crew that shut down years earlier. Others said he had worked as a night janitor at the school and guarded old things until they were carted off in a box. The claims never aligned on age or family, and the only consistent detail remained the manner of speaking that felt learned. Investigators never confirmed any of it, and state records could not connect a stitched initial to a payroll or volunteer ledger. Larch Hollow returned to rain and runoff and alder leaves, and the creek carried silt that settled where the culvert lip flared. In spring, a set of archived notes turned up in a teacher's cabinet during a custodial inventory that followed a small roof repair after heavy weather. The notes included a list of items removed from a stage closet, among them a bell clapper wrapped in cloth and tagged for storage. The tag showed a year written in a hand that looked older than the paper, and the clapper weight matched the bell recorded by the district. The clerk dated the note to a time just before the transfer sheet at the bridge yard, and the sequence suggested a routine move between buildings. No one could say how a clapper could sound without its bell, and records conflict on whether anyone heard such a strike that year. Mara and the deputy met once more at the trailhead on a clear morning, and they walked to the dogleg without speaking. The hollow smelled of wet iron and fir pitch, and the creek ran thinner across fresh gravel shaped by a late slide. They stopped at the culvert, and a small heron lifted from the bank and drifted under low branches with slow wing beats. They listened long enough to agree that the place felt ordinary in daylight, with nothing to mark it from any other ravine. They left without ceremony, and the report never changed, and the borrowed thing stayed unnamed in both their files. The stories. Why the bridge cameras failed during the final crossing. The countdown to the final crossing had been promoted for weeks, and the city promised a clean archived stream. The bridge cameras blinked to black when the convoy rolled, and people kept asking why the goodbye moment vanished. Kira Mendez was 32, and she worked as a municipal traffic systems technician for a mid-river city. Her plan that night was simple, and it involved checking status lights and saving a complete recording of the closure. The steel truss bridge was due for retrofit at midnight, and the transportation office wanted a neat farewell video. She had coffee in a paper cup, and she had a clipboard that made her look official to crews. The incident started 5 minutes before midnight when the feeds showed minor pixelation on the west pylon camera. A few seconds later, the screen tiles on her software wall went gray, and a red banner said signal lost. The last frame showed reflective letters on a banner near the railing and a shuttle bus idling behind a pilot car. The convoy began its slow roll toward the county line, and the control room got very quiet. Kira listened to the archived radio channel, and she heard the bridge supervisor saying to hold speed at 15. A dispatcher replied that news crews were filming from the Riverwalk, and the supervisor said that everyone needed to stay behind the cone. Then the audio captured a short, static burst, and another voice asked if the city still had their picture. The answer was a dry negative, and keyboard taps filled the silence that followed. Witnesses later said the outage was 8 minutes long, and it began as the pilot car reached the crown. A retired custodian named Gideon Pruitt told a reporter that he saw a cabinet in the median flicker. He said it looked like a tiny lightning bug behind the vent slots, and he heard a faint pop like a knuckle crack. His statement landed in an inbox with 3 other messages that said similar things about a brief blue blink. Kira started with the basics, and she pulled logs from the camera management server without touching the lost files. The server thought midnight arrived twice, which never looks good to anyone who has chased timing bugs. She found a warning about an NTP source flap, and the system switched to a GPS puck after losing the building clock. Timing drift can smear security recordings, yet it rarely knocks every feed offline at the exact same minute. She wrote a note that said, "Timing is a clue," not a cause, and she kept digging with patience. The routers showed a spanning tree reconvergence at 4 seconds to midnight, and that got her attention fast. Spanning tree is a safety net that prevents a network from burning itself with a loop, and reconvergence takes time. She called the on-call network tech, a quiet guy named Rowan, and they met at the riverfront cabinet. They opened the cabinet with a city key, and they found a 4-port portable switch with gaffer tape on it. The little device sat between the city gear and a coil of orange cable that led under the guardrail. That was not standard kit. And the tape had a logo from a production company that Kira did not recognize. She photographed the layout, and she unplugged nothing until she finished a full set of angles for the file. Rowan traced the orange cable to a tent where a drone crew had packed cases, and the crew had already left. A security guard named Pavel Rios remembered a friendly woman in a blue jacket asking for power earlier that evening. Pavel said the team wanted to pull a clean feed for a big screen on the Riverwalk, and he pointed to a scuffed outlet strip. His witness statement sounded careful, and he signed the page with a slow, blocky hand. Kira compared the cabinet photos to her notes, and she noticed a second cable on a different VLAN. Someone had bridged the camera network to an admin line, which would let frames fly in circles until the tree shut ports. The timeline fit the gray tiles, and the 8-minute blackout matched the reconvergence delay for a loop across 2 closets. She still needed a trigger for the exact moment, and she did not like guessing when the city would ask for answers. She pulled dispatch logs for the Riverwalk power requests, and she listened to the whole night at double speed. A call at 11:59 reported a countdown clock failing near the viewing area, and a worker asked for a different outlet. Another call at the same minute said a heater had kicked on inside the west cabinet despite a warm night. That heater was a rack warm-up coil used since 2014 to protect hardware in winter, and it drew more than a camera. Rowan frowned at the heater line item, and he pointed to a value on the UPS history that showed a short overload. The little UPS carried the camera injectors and the microwave backhaul radio, and it did not love sudden guests. If the countdown clock plug shared a breaker with the injectors, the draw would push the UPS near its limit for a moment. Near the limit plus a loop is a bad hand, and the loop always wins, because the network saves itself by dropping links. Kira walked the Riverwalk the next morning, and she talked to 2 vendors who had rolled up cords at dawn. One vendor said a volunteer offered a splitter when the big screen lost power, and he remembered the splitter had city tape. Another vendor said the drone crew asked where the cabinet breaker was because their screen kept blinking, and nobody had the answer. The statements were casual, yet they matched the strange dance of power and packets near midnight. She asked the production company for a contact, and a polite manager called her back after lunch with a careful tone. He said their contractor had used a small switch to monitor the public feed, and they believed it was harmless. He said they never intended to touch city networks beyond a documented monitor port, and they had emails to show that fact. He sounded worried, as if lawyers had taught his throat to stay narrow, and he promised to send photos from setup. The photos arrived in compressed form, and they showed a neat tent with a truss and a folding monitor. A cable labeled monitor led toward the guardrail, and a second cable labeled power ran to the same cabinet. The setup looked tidy under good light, and a laminated badge on a case matched the tape Kira had photographed in the cabinet. She added the images to her folder, and she kept the tone neutral in every note she wrote. She still needed to explain the last pieces, and the final footage angle kept bothering her with its reflection. The last frame from the west camera showed a bright banner near the railing, and the letters looked metallic and sharp. A sign vendor later confirmed that the city changed materials at the last minute, and they used Mylar for a brighter look. Mylar near a microwave dish is not a great neighbor, and the backhaul radio sat a few feet behind that railing. Kira climbed the tower stairs with Rowan, and they checked the dish for scuffs or misalignment under gentle wind. The dish was tight, and the cable made a clean loop that would please any inspector who had seen careless work. A scratch along the feed horn matched Gideon's tiny lightning bug description, and Rowan thought a brief arc could have happened. He said a floating ground could arc when a heater kicked in, while a loop forced the switch to rethink its links. They looked at the UPS again, and they saw a time-stamped blip that coincided with the heater line he had noticed earlier. A ground strap near the cabinet door had fresh tool marks, as if someone loosened, then tightened, then loosened again. Pavel remembered a worker with a silver badge checking the strap during the day, and he believed the badge looked temporary. He did not accuse anyone, and he did not embellish, and that made his memory feel steadier with time. A radio hobbyist named Lana Cho sent Kira a short audio clip from her scanner, and it included an interesting fragment. A voice said, "We lost it again, right at 0, and another voice replied, "The mirror banner is killing the dish angle." The clip had the squeal of an open mic, and it included a shout for someone to move the sign immediately. Lana kept the original recording, and she dated it from a receiver with a time reference she maintained carefully. Kira built a timeline that started with setup and ended with the convoy reaching the county line under flashing beacons. The drone crew plugged a small switch to a cabinet monitor port, and they also hit a convenience outlet to power their screen. The countdown team later borrowed that same outlet for a clock, and someone added a splitter that pushed the UPS near the cliff. At the same minute, a heater coil cycled. The loop between camera and admin lines forced Spanning Tree to rewire the network. The microwave backhaul radio tried to hold modulation, while the dish saw Mylar flash from a waving banner over the railing. A brief arc at the horn marked the overload moment, and the UPS shrugged as the injectors cycled in self-defense. The network dropped non-essential links until the tree calmed, and the cameras starved for power while the bus rolled by. 8 minutes later, everything recovered, and the last frames returned to a quiet bridge with only taillights in the distance. She tested the theory instead of declaring it solved, and she set up a controlled loop with a spare cabinet. Rowan brought a portable switch and a splitter, and they hooked a dummy clock and a space heater to simulate draw. They hung a sheet of Mylar behind a small dish, and they watched link lights as the UPS meter leaned into the red. The picture dropped in a pattern that matched the outage graph, and the recovery time was nearly the same as the archived gap. The city attorney asked for careful wording, and Kara kept her report plain and rooted in the logs and statements. She wrote that the outage was caused by a loop introduced by a third-party device connected to a cabinet switch. She wrote that concurrent power draw caused a protective brownout on the injector bank, and the Mylar reflection reduced backhaul margin. She wrote that the combination aligned at the convoy start, and the system behaved as designed to protect itself. There were no villains in the file, and there were only decisions that stacked until one more decision leaned on the pile. The production company paid an invoice for a review of future practices, and they issued a short apology that avoided dramatic language. The city barred portable switching devices from cabinets without written permits, and they posted a plain sign that said, "Do not plug in here." The Riverwalk now had a dedicated outlet post with a meter and a breaker that belonged to special events. Kira saved the last recovered frames in a folder marked Final Moments after the fact, and she kept a second copy offline. She did not watch them often, and she did not chase blame in private, and she slept fine despite a long week. The bridge sulked under scaffolding and tarps for months, and the retrofit finished in a crisp morning 2 years later. People cheered during the reopening, and the cameras held their picture while the first car drifted over the new deck. Later, she visited Gideon at the Riverwalk, and he pointed at the sunset like a man who graded light for a living. He said he liked the quiet after a big repair, and he liked how the river never cared about the drama. Kira laughed, and she said the river had better uptime than most networks she had nursed through storms. He nodded once, and he said the city should write that motto on the cabinet door in permanent black paint. The final crossing remained a story without visuals, and it turned into a local trivia question about timing and luck. People asked why the cameras failed at that exact moment, and she would answer with the same simple sentence. The cameras did not fail. The system protected itself when we pushed it into a corner with too many little choices. It was not sabotage, and it was not a conspiracy, and it was not a broken promise carved in steel. That answer never made headlines, and it never satisfied anyone who needed a single dramatic cause to tie a bow. Yet it was true enough for a file labeled complete, and it was sturdy enough to stand in front of questions. She believed that was all a public story needs, and she believed that was enough to close a small and stubborn loop. The river kept moving, the bridge returned to work, and the cabinets hummed in their careful metal boxes by the rail. The stories. Dispatcher, who kept the secret from a bridge call, the call began with the sound that never leaves him, a river hush that sat under a thin voice. On the log, it read as a welfare check near the west span. The timestamp matched the shift change. The tower camera sent a smeared view of headlights, and the wind pushed rain and slanted ropes across steel. He wrote the first line in block letters. Male caller. Alone. No traffic lane blocked. Unknown age. Unknown intent. In training, they, from the start, had said the first 10 seconds decide the rest. He believed that for years. He had a plain goal that night. Finish paperwork early, drink the cold coffee anyway, and get home before midnight. Kellen Duarte, age 38, worked as an emergency dispatcher in a river town that never liked headlines. He lived quiet. 2 rooms over a grocery where the owner knew his name and saved him bruised peaches. He was good at the slow voice and the clear questions. He kept a notebook with dates and little arrows. On the tape, his opening line sounded the same as always. County Communications, tell me what is happening. The caller coughed, then said he was at the railing near the center truss. He asked for no sirens. Kellen clicked a marker on the map and moved the cursor a hair so the unit tags would not overlap. He asked for a name, and the caller hesitated like he was picking one from a shelf he had not visited. Call me Ross, the man said, then added something about the water looking like foil if you did not blink. There was a push of air like a mic against a jacket, and the traffic under the bridge hummed steady. Kellen kept the tone even, told Ross that people could meet him where he stood, and asked what brought him there. Someone I loved died on this bridge, Ross said. And his voice steadied, like he had waited to finally say it. In his log, Kellen wrote the words that mattered. Loss stated. Prior connection to scene. No weapons reported. Calm speech. From the other console, Nira scrolled road closures and passed him a sticky note that read, Northbound lane is clear. He muted the room feed for a second, so the printer squeal would not land in Ross's ear and spook him. He asked the year of the loss, and Ross said it fast, like it tasted bad. 2014. Kellen repeated the year and let the silence work while he dispatched a patrol car and a medic unit in the background. He knew the story people told about that year. A sedan climbed the curb during a storm and hit a contractor. The papers had run one photo of cones and a dropped hard hat. No names followed, just an archived blurb and rain. From the tower camera, a freight train horn carried along the riverbank, then faded as the unit names flashed en route. Kellen asked if Ross knew the person who died by name. Ross said he knew the face and the last words. A small thing changed in Kellen then. A sound from the record shelf in his mind fell flat and stayed there. He once took a midnight call from a work crew foreman near the same span. He kept that tape in memory. Ross said the last words were not for him. They were for a dispatcher who told the crew to hold 10 minutes. Kellen tapped the headset cushion, careful to keep the room quiet, and asked where Ross had heard those words. Ross said he had heard them from a phone found in a cracked case under the North Pier after the storm. He said the phone worked for one day after the rain stopped, and that he had played the last message recorded. He said the message was from County Communications with a different voice, and it told the crew to stay clear. Kellen felt the old shift wash through him. The storm year had ended in a tangle of rumors and a closed memo. He had read that memo while filing tired overtime sheets. He filed it without speaking and chose to keep moving. On the camera, one pair of headlights slowed near the shoulder as if a driver could sense the weight of the rail. Kellen radioed the nearest cruiser to stage 2 blocks off with lights off, and he asked Nira to notify the medic quietly. He asked Ross to tell him who the contractor was, and Ross said the name with a short stop between first and last. The name matched the contractor mentioned in the closed memo, except the memo had spelled the name without an accent mark. Kellen wrote the name as Ross said it, exact and careful, then underlined it once for the transcription that would follow. He asked Ross why he came now and not earlier, and Ross said an anniversary sits on the mind like a stone. He also said that the memo never named the dispatcher who told the crew to hold, which was why he had called. Kellen understood the shape of that ask, even if the words around it were soft. He was not supposed to name staff. The policy existed for safety and sanity, and it covered nights when grief needs a door and someone tries that door. He told Ross he could share what the record allows, and he asked if hearing the process might help him stand. Ross said hearing the process might help, though he refused the idea of sirens again and asked for plain truth instead. Kellen kept his sentence length slow and warm. He said that storm calls can trigger staggered staging for worker safety. He said if there were downed lines or compromised joints, a hold might be given while a state engineer was patched in. He also said that every such hold carried timestamps, and that those stamps were kept by policy for 7 years. Ross breathed in and asked what happens when 7 years have passed, and Kellen answered before he could think of softness. He said the system cycles recordings to deep archives after 7 years, and some are erased when retention windows expire. Ross said he had a copy in case the archive could not confirm. Then he claimed the voice on the tape named a company. He said the tape used a phrase that a dispatcher would not use unless someone off-channel asked for a careful delay. Kellen had heard that phrase once. It was the night a junior engineer requested a slow approach while a supervisor closed a lane. The phrase was not suspicious by itself, and yet, in memory, it wore the shape of a request he never liked. He asked Ross to read the phrase, and Ross said it. Hold 10 for a clear handoff if site control is missing. Neera glanced over with a look that said, "Do not get pulled into the river." Kellen nodded and kept the pace steady. He told Ross he could not speak to motives of old voices, and he could not name a colleague or contractor from memory. He said he could meet Ross with a sergeant who knew the policy, and they could file a supplemental report for records. Ross said he was tired of reports. Then he asked a new question. Was someone paid to push that hold in the storm? Kellen chose his words like glass marbles placed in a line. He said he had not seen evidence that proved a bribe. He said he had seen maintenance slips that missed dates in years with bad weather, and he had seen budgets cut twice. He said contracts sometimes shifted mid-season, and miscommunication could look like intent when viewed through grief and time. The cruiser staged in the dark lot of a bait shop, and the medic idled near a closed diner with frosted windows. The tower camera picked up two figures near the midspan, and the wind made their jackets move like wet flags. Kellen asked Ross if someone stood with him, and Ross said a cyclist had stopped and was holding a flashing light. He asked the cyclist for the phone, and the cyclist, shouting through wind, said he would hold the light where Ross stood. Kellen brought the cruiser onto the bridge, slow and quiet, then asked Ross to look over his right shoulder for headlights. He said he would keep talking while the car approached, and he would ask simple things about the person lost. Ross began to tell a short life. He said she had a laugh that came in bursts, and she liked folded maps. He said she had taken a night shift to help a younger sister, and she kept a lanyard with a faded tag. He said he watched her set cones before the storm hit, and he watched the curve where the sedan took the line. He said no one saw the driver afterward, and the report guessed water pushed evidence downriver where it turned to silt. He said the tape he found made his chest hurt because someone with a badge kept people where the wind was worst. Kellen said he heard the pain and he believed the sincerity. Then he asked Ross to step back from the rail 1 foot. He said small choices add minutes, and minutes stack into plans, and plans turn into days that someone can live through. The cruiser moved a foot at a time. The officer called in with a whisper to confirm eyes on the subjects. The wind kicked a tab of paper along the sidewalk, and the camera caught it hopping like a small animal in rain. Kellen asked Ross about the cracked case at the pier, and Ross said the fisherman who found it gave him the phone. He said he cleaned the mud with rice and heat, and the screen woke like a held breath and showed the saved audio. Kellen pictured a kitchen table with towels and a humming space heater and the stubborn work of saving a last voice. He told Ross that someone who would do that kind of work could also stand away from the edge and breathe tonight. Ross said people kept calling him crazy when he brought the phone around, and one clerk said to forget old storms. He said he would go if someone could promise the message would not vanish into a hole where things get lost. Kellen had a rule: never promise anything that depends on someone else. He made a different promise instead and wrote it down. He said he would take a copy himself, and he would log it as a citizen recording attached to a supplemental report. He said he would list the time and origin as provided, and he would initial the line and add a contact number. Ross went quiet, and the wind filled the line again, and the cruiser stopped a car length away with no flashers. The officer on the bridge said he saw a second person keeping distance, and the cyclist raised the light toward the railing. Kellen asked Ross if hearing a small true thing might help him come off the rail. Ross told him to say it plain. Kellen told him there was an internal review back then, and it did not find a bribe, but it did find a silence. He said a manager failed to file a conflict disclosure and a vendor had a nephew on a crew scheduled for that week. He said the manager resigned before the report made the rounds, and the findings lived behind a line marked personnel matter. He said he had read that line with tired eyes and wished it said more, and that was the part he kept. He did not say the other part out loud, which was the line about a recommended reprimand for delayed notifications. He did not say the name of the dispatcher who missed a handoff while moving units during the storm shift. He did not say that the reprimand belonged to him for a calendar mistake that lost 2 minutes when the server lagged. He believed the 2 minutes had not caused the death, yet he carried them like a coin that burned his pocket. Ross stood very still. He asked why no one told the public that someone had been asked to resign quietly. Kellen said the county tells what it must by law, and the rest gathers dust and waits for someone to ask again. He said he understood that wait, then asked Ross to walk toward the cruiser while the cyclist kept the light behind. Ross said he wanted to hand the phone over himself and watch it enter the chain that could not be erased. Kellen told the officer to receive the device and document the handoff on camera, then he told the medic to stage closer. He kept talking to Ross about the quiet details of grief as the officer moved with hands open and calm shoulders. Ross stepped away from the rail, and the wind made the tension a little louder. Then the cruiser door clicked open. The officer took the phone and read the time on the screen for the camera, then thanked Ross and nodded at the cyclist. The medic stepped out with a blanket and stood near, and the cyclist said he would bike Ross home if that helped. Kellen set the line to a low hold and told Nira to mark the recording flagged for retention review and supervisory copy. He also wrote a note for himself to call records in the morning and ask for a manual pull from the deep archive. He would say the citizen copy exists and should be paired with any surviving log from the storm year for clarity. He would not say the rest, which was that he had been the one to misread the calendar view during a switch. He shifted to the closing questions that help people move. Any harm today? Any plan tonight? Any safe place to stay? Ross said he would stay with a friend who owed him a favor, and he would bring coffee to the cyclist as thanks. He said he would wait to hear if the recording matched the archive, and he would not visit the bridge again at night. Kellen said someone would call him within 3 business days, which felt safe to offer, and he wrote his own number anyway. He signed the log with a quick line and filed the incident under welfare resolved with evidence collected and no injury. The bridge camera caught the cruiser pulling away slow while the medic followed, and the cyclist lights faded toward the trail. Nira slid over a cup with fresh coffee and asked if he was okay, and he said yes, since people had stepped off safe. He picked up his notebook and drew a small square around the words he had written, which read, "Keep the silence clean." He drove home as rain dripped from the awning of the grocery, and the owner waved from a dark window with a thin smile. He unlocked the door and set his notebook on the table. Then he took the spare tape recorder from a drawer beside the sink. He spoke the date and the incident number and a short summary. Then he said 7 words that were just for the tape. He said the bridge call reminded him why small errors multiply and why a person can choose to carry them alone. In the morning, he brought the tape to the records clerk as a personal note to accompany the citizen copy for context. He did not include the part about his own reprimand, which lived on paper in a file that no one requested. He told the clerk that the caller needed confidence, that the system held memory, and the clerk said that part was done. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived to confirm the match, and the archived call contained the same phrase and timing. The letter said the review board would annotate the old memo to reflect the vendor relationship that had been missed. It also said the findings still pointed to weather and a panicked driver as primary causes rather than any delayed instruction. Kellen stood at the window and read the lines twice, then folded the letter and slid it under the notebook cover. He walked the long way to work and past the river that pretended to be quiet, while tugs moved lumber under the span. He thought about the part he had kept and judged whether it belonged in daylight or whether it still lived best in private. He decided to hold it until it served someone to hear it, which was not the same as hiding and felt closer to care. The stories. The night guard, who logged footsteps beneath the church basement. He logged the first footsteps at 2:14, then again at 3:05, and nothing about those times made sense. The basement lights stayed off, the motion sensor blinked idle green, yet something moved under the concrete where no hallway existed. The night guard was named Alaric Boone, age 54, a retired freight dispatcher who took quiet work after his divorce. He covered the overnight shift at a weathered church on a bluff, a place with a gym, a pantry, and a low stone basement. His simple goal for that Tuesday was making rounds, checking doors, keeping the coffee hot, and finishing a crossword before sunrise. During his second loop, he heard the first set, a faint two-beat rhythm under the boiler room, steady and human. He froze by the cinder block wall, his pencil lifted, and he realized he could feel the vibration through his shoes. He marked the time in his pocket notebook, then radioed a single check-in to keep the board honest. The church sat near a small river where old mills once ran, and tunnels stitched the slope like forgotten seams. He had heard stories from lunch volunteers about a coal chute, a dumbwaiter, even a choir passage sealed long ago. None of those old features mapped exactly to the boiler room, which sat on fresh concrete poured after a flood in 2005. Alaric finished the round and told himself it was heat pipes, which seemed reasonable, though the tempo was wrong. The boiler was off to save fuel, set to wait closer to dawn, and the thermostats showed a flat night. He waited near the fuse panel and heard it again, slow steps south to north, then quiet like someone listening. He walked upstairs and checked the parking lot, which held a single sedan from a choir tenor who worked late. Across the street, the antique shop was dark, its sign unlit, the display of rotary phones a grid of dust. The guard wrote the second time down, circled it, and added a question mark he would rather have avoided. He kept a clean log because writing straight helped his nerves. A trick learned dispatching trucks through winter storms. His notebook already listed door tests, flashlight levels, and notes about the food pantry deliveries with initials and counts. Now it held two odd entries about a place that should have been solid fill and reinforced slab. On Wednesday, he set a baseline, because the simplest first step is confirming the pattern before trying explanations. He arrived 10 minutes early, brewed coffee, and walked the perimeter before the staff left and the alarms armed. He chalked a thin line along the boiler room floor, just a mark to see if any hairline crack shifted. At 2:17, he felt the same two-beat rhythm. Heel, then toe, careful, like someone stepping between puddles. It moved toward the old pantry wall, paused, then returned, and he heard a small scrape, as if brushing stone. He checked the chalk line and found nothing disturbed, which frustrated him more than if he had found scuffs. He called the on-call contact listed as Pastor Lionel Cade, age 61, a spare-voiced man who rarely slept. The pastor answered and said the church once tied into a storm culvert and the city sealed it after floods. He added that the map might be wrong, since old projects drifted from paperwork when donations moved faster than permits. The footsteps returned at 3:11, and he recorded them by holding his phone against the wall, letting the mic listen. The audio picked up a rhythmic, bassy thump and a single metal tick, like a ring hitting a pipe. He labeled the file with the date and the time and sent it to himself because he backed up everything. On Thursday, he walked the block in the afternoon and spoke with Rhea Voss, age 47, the daytime custodian. She said a volunteer once mentioned a hatch under the choir risers, then shrugged and said that was before her time. She also said a city crew excavated near the alley last winter, chasing a water pressure loss on the block. He pulled the Public Works hotline and asked for archived lines, using calm words and the steady cadence that gets patience. The operator routed him to records, where an email arrived with basic utility diagrams marked revised after 2005. The drawing placed a retired branch running 30 feet under the church, labeled Service Abandoned with a faint dotted spur. He printed the map and folded it into his pocket, then took his shift with a small knot riding his stomach. That night, the sound came earlier, 1:59, and closer to the North Foundation, which meant a path existed. He pressed his ear to the block, ignored the smell of dust and fuel oil, and heard soft breathing between steps. He decided to compare his notes against external clocks, a habit from dispatch that filtered coincidence from signal with patience. He checked transit schedules and found a freight delivery to the antique shop at midnight every other day, closed route. He marked those days with a triangle in the margin, then noticed the footsteps fell hours after the truck departed. On Friday, he asked the food pantry director, a patient woman named Mavis Alcott, age 50, whether someone used the basement. She said the pantry closed at 6 and the keys were tracked. Then she looked worried and asked if something happened. He told her he heard odd noise, nothing dangerous yet, and he would keep her informed before calling the police. He reached out to a friend who knew Boots by tread, a park ranger named Pietro Licari, age 42. Pietro listened to the phone recording and said the spacing suggested a careful adult, not a kid, likely carrying weight. He told Alaric to watch for a scrape on the off foot, a marker of someone testing boards or stones. That night, Alaric brought a cheap wildlife camera from a hardware store, just a unit that logged sound and temperature changes. He set it in the boiler room, not for video since there was nothing to see, but for time-stamped audio. He also sprinkled a narrow ribbon of flour near the expansion joint because footprints sometimes post where eyes cannot. At 2:08, the floor hummed lightly, the air felt cooler near the wall, and the camera clicked after a shift. Later, he played it back and heard a new detail, a small spray like water under pressure, then a hand tap. It sounded like someone touched a pipe and felt for vibration, which made the knot in his stomach tighten. On Saturday afternoon, he visited the public library and asked for old fire insurance maps, the kind surveyors hoarded. The librarian brought a set from 1948 and 1963, which showed a coal room under the choir. A narrow passage ran toward the river, marked as service, with a note stating shared utility with neighboring parcel. The neighboring parcel matched the antique shop, which made sense to old builders who shared trenches and split costs when money was scarce. He copied the sheet and took it to the pastor, who studied the lines, then sighed and rubbed his jaw. The pastor said a previous board closed the passage after a minor flood, then let the city handle whatever remained. Alaric asked permission to open the old choir risers to check for a hatch, and the pastor agreed to supervised access. They pulled 2 sections and found only plywood and dust, which meant the hatch was either gone or moved. Yet along the north sill, a set of nails showed different age, darker and uneven, as if boards were reused. That night, the footsteps ran later, almost 4, and quicker, like someone in a hurry who disliked being underground. He thought about calling the police, but worried he would deliver a false alarm and lose the trust he needed. Instead, he called the non-emergency line and reported suspicious subterranean noise, and the dispatcher logged it with a routine number. On Sunday morning, a congregant named Basil Ortega, age 60, told him he once saw steam venting in the alley. Basil said it happened near a rusted rectangle that looked like an access panel, then he made a helpless shrug. He also said an unfamiliar white van loaded crates behind the antique shop 2 nights earlier, long after the truck left. Alaric used his lunch to walk the alley, where he found a metal cover sunk into cracked asphalt beside an old drain. The cover was not city standard, the screws mismatched, the edges marked by recent scrapes where a bar pried. He took photos from 3 angles and emailed them to the pastor, then placed a tiny pencil mark by a bolt. He returned that night and listened, and when the footsteps began, he watched his phone clock and checked the flour. The new powder held a single faint dent by the joint, not a full print, but enough to show pressure. He leaned closer and smelled faint bleach, which meant someone cared about leaving little behind, a detail that narrowed possibilities. On Monday, he flagged the city water department and asked whether any reports showed pressure fluctuations overnight in that block. A supervisor called back and said there were brief spikes every few nights around 3, like a valve opening and closing. He added that an inspector noted a missing cap on a retired service branch near the river last winter. That call changed the tone, because pressure spikes paired with footsteps turned from mystery to infrastructure problem with risk. He told the pastor he would ask police for a walkthrough, then called the same dispatcher and requested a non-emergency assist. A patrol officer arrived with calm posture and a flashlight, listened to the audio, and agreed to a careful look. They checked the alley cover first and found the pencil mark missing, replaced by a fresh smear of dirt and oil. The officer requested a utility truck, and a crew appeared with a wrench and a portable meter that hummed softly. The crew measured sound through the cover and picked up flow. Not strong, but a whisper moving in pulses like breathing. They paused for a supervisor, who arrived with a locked case that held a camera snake used on drains and conduits. The team fed the lens past the cover and into a rough concrete passage that curved toward the church foundation. The view showed shoe scuffs on the dust, then a brass T-valve patched into an old water line with tape, The supervisor killed the street feed, then pointed at the tape and said someone had no license for that kind of work. He also said a misthreaded cap could vent gas from the adjacent service, which shifted the conversation from curiosity to hazard. The officer requested a second unit to secure the block, and they cleared the alley while keeping voices low. Inside the church, Alaric stood by the boiler room while the utility meter ticked, confirming a slight pressure bleed through the slab. The footsteps started again, softer this time, then stopped when the water cut out, which pinned the pattern with confidence. He radioed the officer, who whispered that someone was still down there, then signaled the team to quiet. A darker shape glided past the camera lens, and a hand reached to the valve, then froze when it found no resistance. The hand wore a thin mechanic glove with a tear at the knuckle, a detail that stood out like a flag. The officer announced presence through the cover, voice firm without volume, telling the person to stay still and breathe easy. A minute stretched heavy, then a voice answered, shaky and tired, saying he was stuck because the valve handle jammed. The team opened the cover and escorted out a man in his late 30s, pale, layered in dust and damp. He gave his name as Trenton Vale, age 38, the owner of the antique shop across the street with deliveries. He said he entered the old service passage months ago after a plumber showed a way to run a supplemental water line. He said he needed pressure for cleaning and steaming items, though his meter and bills did not match the usage schedule. He admitted he liked the privacy, then insisted he never touched the gas, which the utility crew would later verify. They checked his shop and found a narrow door behind a rack of film cameras that opened onto the same cracked alley. There were wet footprints on the threshold, hex-patterned soles with a little drag on the right, matching the sound spacing. There was a box of brass fittings, a saw with minimal filings, and a cardboard tray holding mismatched valve caps. At the station, according to the later report, he told them a contractor left the tool and he only learned by watching. He said the passage felt safer at night because the street was empty and he liked the quiet under the church. He also said he heard a bell once through the stone and timed his movements between scheduled campus patrols. The city documented the patched valve, sealed the retired branch, and fined the shop for unauthorized connection and trespass through utility right-of-way. The gas line near the valve showed no tampering, which eased everyone, though the near miss tightened throats along the block. The police shared a copy of the dispatch log, noting the initial call as checked and secured. Ulrich printed the log and glued it into his notebook beside the first pencil scrawl about the 2-beat rhythm. He added a short summary stating that the footsteps tracked to an illegal water tap under the slab, then paused. He wrote that the timing aligned with utility spikes, and the alley cover thread marks confirmed regular access before the shutdown. The pastor thanked him in a staff meeting, with witnesses confirming calm handling and careful records that guided city response. Rhea patted his shoulder and said the flower idea was odd and smart, then promised to mop where he dusted. Mavis delivered coffee and said the pantry would have closed for days if the water had been fouled by sediment. Pietro called and laughed softly, saying the drag heard in the recording matched the right boot scuff found at the door. He said the pattern on the sole looked like an old surplus boot, hex blocks that turned slick on damp concrete. He liked that a simple tape recorder pinned a path better than a dozen guesses and said, "Well done." Weeks later, the utility crew returned and filled the passage with flowable mix, a gray slurry that hardens without voids. They left a small marker in the alley for the map, a stamped square showing the retired line and closure date. Inside the boiler room, the floor stayed quiet. The green light blinked the same, and the chalk line gathered dust. People asked Alaric if he was scared while listening to footsteps underneath, and he always answered with a half smile. He said fear is different from alert, and alert is what he used when tracking trucks through black ice before sunrise. He also said the quiet afterward felt heavier than the noise because silence makes you question whether you imagined everything. He kept the notebook in his locker and reread the first pages when he doubted why small details matter during routine nights. The triangle marks still sat by the delivery days, and the circles still highlighted the times that repeated like a clock. He had added a final entry, stating that listening is a skill, and that meters and maps are companions. Trenton kept the shop open under a suspended operations agreement, limited hours, supervised water, and a written promise about deliveries. He came by once with a receipt and asked the pastor to sign a community service form for repair work around the lot. He paused near the boiler room door and stared at the concrete, then thanked Alaric without meeting his eyes. Alaric nodded and said, "Take care," then wrote a line later that night about how people choose their own pressure. He meant water and he meant life, and the line read corny on the page, so he crossed a word and moved on. He folded the notebook closed, poured fresh coffee, and walked the church perimeter while the river hummed under the bluff. He still listened in places others ignored because careful listening had made a map where drawings ended and footsteps began. He carried the printed utility sketch until the paper softened, then kept the new revised copy with the closure stamp. He filed both in a manila folder labeled basement under the church, just a marker in case memory failed years later. In his mind, the story stayed simple. A man heard footsteps where no hallway should run and wrote the times carefully. The notes pressed outward into witnesses, maps, meters, and one rusted cover that told the truth when a bolt turned. The payoff was not drama, but a good fix, which is better, and the quiet afterward made sense again. The disappearance of the highway patrolman near Ash Fork. A winter front moved across the high mesas west of Williams when a patrol unit stopped near Ash Fork on the interstate shoulder. The first call to county dispatch described a parked cruiser with lights flicking in windblown grit and no visible officer nearby. The officer was David Keller, 39 highway patrolman, assigned to traffic enforcement along the corridor between Seligman and Williams that week. He left the substation after a routine briefing about black ice formations reported by truckers along shaded cuts east of town. His stated purpose, according to state records, was to monitor a construction taper set along a narrow bridge approach near mile marker 264. The cruiser camera showed lane markers bending through frost and snow feathers moving like powder from the plow ridges. The microphone captured only windrush and an ignition idle that shifted pitch as the alternator compensated for light bar draw. Maria Ortega, 47, long-haul driver, was hauling insulated produce toward Kingman after picking up palletized freight in Flagstaff near dawn. Her log noted a slowdown near the Ash Fork interchange and a trooper unit angled behind a stranded sedan with hazard lights. She reportedly saw a figure in a dark jacket walk from the cruiser toward the guardrail where the shoulder turned to brush. Her statement, filed that night, added that drifting spindrift obscured the figure almost immediately after the door shut. She did not stop because a second unit was expected based on advisory messages that reached her cab radio. Dispatch logs for that afternoon reference Keller advising a plate check on an older sedan with temporary tags that did not match the make. The recorded time, taken from console entries, put the event near 9:15 as the snow intensified around Low Scrub Hills. A reply from records confirmed a mismatch that required a further stop review under procedure regarding possible fraudulent registration display. Traffic camera frames captured the sedan signal across the taper before easing into the shoulder where cones began. The sedan position remained consistent across several frames until a burst of powder erased details beyond the guardrail. Archived notes from the local maintenance yard describe a temporary drop in visibility near the bridge over Partridge Creek during mid-morning. A crew foreman wrote that crosswinds from the north pushed powder through the taper and rattled plastic drums against the barrier ends. Those notes mentioned a lone cruiser parked short of the bridge nose, with the driver door open wider than expected in such wind. The yard memo carried no conclusion about the patrol activity, only an instruction to reposition drums once visibility returned. The author of the memo later said he believed the trooper waved him through while attending to the sedan driver. State records list Keller as a 9-year veteran with prior wildfire support experience and winter operations training completed during 2 recent seasons. He qualified on roadside risk protocols that included 3-point positioning of flares, with an emphasis on avoiding smoke recoil near fuel vapors. Training outlines suggest he would be unlikely to leave his engine running without attention for longer than a few minutes during a live stop. The cruiser computer recorded multiple authentication pings, which indicates the engine remained on while the unit computer stayed awake. Investigators never confirmed whether door sensors captured an accurate timeline since the harness connector had intermittent faults noted earlier that month. A ranch hand named Luke Porter, 32, seasonal worker, crossed the frontage road to check drifting across his gate while winds pushed snow into shallow dunes. He later told deputies that the sedan driver leaned on the guardrail and smoked while the trooper spoke on the radio. Porter described the driver as medium height with a bright scarf, though he admitted distance, snow glare, and wind made everything seem grainy. Some locals claimed the scarf detail belonged to a different sighting on a different day, and records conflict on the time. Porter insisted the memory fixed around the sound of a freight horn rolling across the draws east of town. At midday, the construction taper crew returned from a salt run and found the sedan door ajar against the rail, scuffed by spindrift. The car interior held a coffee cup, a glove, and a folded paper map soaked at the creases by driven snow. County deputies found the keys under the driver's seat and a registration stub that matched a plate number different from the displayed tag. The county file from 2009 includes a guidance form about counterfeit temporary tags that investigators cited during the first briefing. They towed the sedan to the yard while a search team worked the brush south of the bridge where cattails lay crushed in wind lanes. The cruiser remained on the shoulder with the light bar switching through patterns as the battery bus dipped under alternating loads. A second unit arrived and found the radio on local repeat and the shotgun still locked in its bracket under the console. The driver's seat carried Keller's jacket, and his hat rested brim down on the passenger floor as if placed there to avoid wind. Boot prints led from the driver door toward the rail and then along the barrier toward the creek bed cut by winter flow. The prints doubled back once, then broke apart where powder filled the depressions and obscured direction near chaparral that clung to the slope. Searchers followed the creek line downstream toward the junction where ice forms brittle shelves shaded by basalt outcrops. They flagged scuffs that might be boot scrapes against rock ledges and found a small light clipped to a vest strap under a snow lip. The light belonged to Keller based on an engraved initial, though the battery showed charge and the clicker worked without failure. A glove liner lay 7 strides away, and a plastic evidence ruler set in photographs showed a consistent tread shape in compressed powder. The pattern matched the department-issue boot ranked for winter operations, which gave confidence for a concentrated sweep along the left bank. During the afternoon, Maria Ortega delivered her trailer to a Kingman yard and returned to speak with investigators about the scarf and the smoking driver. She said the driver stood still, as if bracing against wind while keeping the cigarette cupped, a habit she recognized from mountain passes. Her recollection placed Keller between the driver and the cruiser, with his shoulder radio lifted toward his face near the guardrail posts. Investigators never confirmed a radio transmission during that precise moment because a repeater outage occurred when power fluctuations hit the tower. That outage appears in utility reports and in dispatch logs that reference brief static bursts followed by dead air and reset signals. A wildlife officer named Eli Warren, 58, retired wildfire crew and seasonal ranger, joined the search along the creek meanders after volunteers formed grids. He knew runoff channels around Ash Fork from years of mapping nesting sites before spring and recognized several sink pockets that collect powder after wind events. Warren found a patch where snow seemed scooped in an oval and pressed by a heavy form sliding downslope from the rail. He marked the spot and radioed, then followed a short skid toward brush where a torn cuff rested under a juniper limb. The cuff stitching matched Keller's uniform issue based on a later lab note included with photographs and chain of custody forms. Archive notes from a prior winter mention a similar drift pocket that formed under a jumping wind at that same bend near the bridge turn. A plow foreman described how cars could appear to settle into a whiteout while only yards away from bare gravel strips. The note advised units to overrun the cone line and stop farther past the bridge nose to avoid the funneling gusts through the guardrail posts. Keller's vehicle position, marked in spray paint after the tow, sat just within the funnel sector described by the maintenance memo. Whether he knew the risk is unknown, though his training files include a section on wind eddies around barrier terminations. State records show several calls from travelers reporting a figure walking the median hours after the initial stop near Ash Fork. One call suggested the figure carried a bright cloth that whipped in the wind and then vanished behind a salt truck spray. Another caller described a uniformed person moving along the barrier and then crouching between drums as a semi passed with slush boost. Investigators ran those reports against lane camera frames, but could not align the timestamps with known truck movements recorded by the waystation. The mismatch left a gap that investigators noted without drawing conclusions, because records conflict across sources and clocks drifted during the outage. Late light washed the draws as a helicopter searched with a thermal unit that read the landscape in pale washes of heat and shadow. The camera picked up coyotes moving single file and a herd of pronghorns scattered across a fence gap south of the interstate. No human heat bloom appeared along the creek banks, where teams marked probable flow paths between junipers and basalt shelves. At dusk, the teams withdrew as temperature fell and a clear sky promised a hard freeze over the drift pockets. A deputy stayed with the cruiser as a tow prepared for removal, and a tarp covered the windshield to protect interior prints. The sedan owner, contacted through registration files, lived in Mohave County and reported the plates stolen during summer before the snow season. He said he sold the car 2 weeks earlier to a buyer who paid cash and took the vehicle without a name entered on the title. The description given by the seller did not match the figure Maria recalled near the guardrail smoking through the wind. Investigators never confirmed whether the buyer and the driver were the same person because the transaction lacked a recorded bill of sale. A later inquiry noted small drill marks near the plate bracket that suggested a quick swap performed without care for alignment. Some locals claimed a patrolman once warned about a narrow step near the rail where the fill slumped during heavy thaw years ago. The county road book included an entry about that settle with a recommendation for riprap that budget delays postponed beyond another season. Snow filled the depression in layers as wind drove crystals against the rail and then into the low along the slope. A person stepping from the shoulder could slide, lose balance, and strike brush before arresting on a shelf near the creek bend. Searchers tested that route and found scraped bark, small threads of uniform cloth, and granular ice chips stuck to the fabric. The last confirmed radio position for Keller triangulated near the bridge nose using signal strength from 2 towers before the repeater outage rolled through. A technician later explained that strength readings mislead during ground refraction under cold inversions over the mesas. The estimate still set him within a short walk of the cruiser at the time Maria saw the jacketed figure by the guardrail. That alignment supports the view that he had not walked far before. Snow and wind obscured his path across the drift pocket. Whether he pursued the driver on foot or stepped away to inspect the sedan underside remained unsettled after weeks of review. The county file from 2009 contains a checklist for cold weather searches that the sheriff cited when expanding the grid into the draws. The list emphasizes boot impressions in powder and the capture of small textile fragments where brush scrapes occur along narrow paths. Teams returned over several days and documented scattered impressions that led nowhere once sun crusted the surface and wind reset the field. A scarf fragment appeared near a cattail stand and matched no clothing from Keller's locker or department inventory logged at the substation. Some locals claimed it proved the driver moved along the creek line, though investigators never confirmed a full scarf from the fragment alone. In the following week, the snow receded along south faces, while shaded pockets kept their stiff crusts under cedar boughs. Maintenance crews removed the taper and set a warning board about drifting near the rail gap by the bridge nose. The patrol cruiser remained off-duty as lab teams worked the interior and finally returned it to the yard behind a chain-link fence. State records note that Keller's radio keyed several times after the outage cleared, though no voice transmissions followed those key events. Technicians attributed the signals to automated resets and not to manual use, a conclusion recorded after firmware inspections at the communications shop. Several archived notes, reference calls from hikers along a section of old roadbed west of Ash Fork where cinders surface in thin patches. They reported finding a badge clip near a juniper, though the badge itself was absent and the clip showed corrosion from prior seasons. Investigators marked the find as uncertain due to lack of provenance and possible placement by wind or by animal movement across Camp Detritus. That entry sits beside a note about a lunch receipt found in brush near the bridge, a receipt that matched Keller's purchase from a Williams diner. The receipt time falls within the morning window and supports his presence on the route earlier than the stop near the taper. Months later, runoff deepened the creek and exposed stones where snow once stacked and preserved shallow marks along the slope. A volunteer team found a radio cord near a root snag, its plug scuffed and the insulation cut by a sharp edge. The department radio in Keller's cruiser still carried its cord, which made the creek find a likely unrelated item from unknown origin. Some locals claimed it showed parts shed in a struggle, yet investigators never confirmed a second radio issued to Keller that winter. The find joined a small shelf of objects in the evidence room with tags that read uncertain and deferred pending future comparison tests. Records conflict on the final sighting time because different calls reached the sheriff line and the highway line as power returned in uneven blocks. A tourist bus reported a figure in reflective trousers east of the interchange, walking against traffic with an arm raised toward a plow. Another traveler said a uniformed man stood behind drums and waved a flashlight below waist level near the bridge nose. Neither sighting aligned with camera frames due to snow sheets over the lenses and abrupt exposure shifts when trucks passed. The investigative summary notes that conflicting timelines, complicated verification, and left sequence uncertainties that never closed despite successive interviews. The official notice lists David Keller as missing while off the shoulder of the interstate near Ash Fork during a winter weather event. The notice states he exited his vehicle during a stop involving a sedan with mismatched registration and did not return to the cruiser. It also states that search operations covered the creek line, the brush slopes, and the construction taper area with negative results beyond clothing fragments. The write-up includes references to dispatch logs, to state records, to archived notes, and to the county file. From 2009, the final line records that investigators never confirmed a route of travel or conclusive contact with any identified driver from the sedan. The bridge approaches now carry riprap under the rail where the settle once formed a shallow step hidden by wind and snow powder. A small marker for a generic safety reminder sits near the shoulder where the view opens toward distant hills and a thin band of pines. Drivers pass with steady speed, and the wind still pulls through the guardrail posts and rattles the plastic drums when storms cross the mesas. Some locals claimed a trooper lights the shoulder during those storms, and a flicker rides the spindrift before sliding into the draw. The remark appears in several informal statements, and investigators never confirmed any source beyond reflection and powder-crossing headlight beams. The stories. This motel room voicemail raised a separate question. On a rainy Tuesday, near the end of tourist season, a motel room voicemail carried a question that did not belong. It turned a tired end of shift into something careful and strange, and it started with a blinking red light. Dorian Pike worked nights at the Northway Motor Inn, 37, a patient manager who fixed things others ignored. The place sat off a service road past a truck stop, with a diner and a feed store as neighbors. He started that shift with a simple goal: balance the register, finish the towel count, and coax the ice machine back alive. The storm slowed arrivals, and the security monitor rolled its quiet grayscale loop of the parking lot. Housekeeping left a note about room 12, the kind of note other managers forgot to read. The bed looked unused after checkout, the television glowed at low volume, and the phone message light blinked at eye level. He carried a spare key, pushed the door open, and smelled damp carpet and motel soap. Nothing surprising. The news channel murmured through commercials, a static map of counties he could name without trying. On the nightstand sat a spiral notebook half full of block letters, a takeout cup, and a key card with the room number worn. He pressed the voicemail button with his knuckle, because the button shocked him once in summer. A male voice filled the room with a flat question that stopped his hand, like a bad chord laid wrong. The voice asked, "Did you move the smoke detector again?" And then silence, followed by the system tone and cutoff. He replayed it twice, and the question felt like a pebble in a shoe, something to be dealt with. Smoke detectors did not get moved by guests without reason, and nothing about the room said routine or careless. Dorian checked the detector on the ceiling, a cheap white unit that did not match the others on the hall. The motel used one supplier for replacements, and this casing lacked their sticker and the penciled date inside. He stood on the chair, unscrewed the ring, and found fresh scuffs around the mounting plate as if removed recently. The unit felt heavier than a sensor should, and the test light never flashed, which meant battery or guts. He set it down on the table, and the vent above the television rattled just a little with the wind. He turned off the television, let the room get quiet, and heard faint tapping through the vent to the next room. The motel had a habit of telling its secrets through noise, and he had learned that language over years. He stepped into the hall and knocked on room 14, where a regular was finishing a long week of fieldwork. Quinn Hauer was 29, a cell tower contractor with a tool bag and a precise way of speaking. Quinn opened the door and said, "Heard the tapping, thought it was heat, but it kept hitching, like somebody counting seconds." Dorian nodded, thanked him, and walked back to room 12 with the detector in his hands and a growing list. He checked the guest ledger for that room, found the name Shane Bennett written in rough ballpoint yesterday afternoon. The rate was paid in cash with a $20 deposit, and there was a note about requesting a high floor. The motel only had 2 floors, which made the request sound like reflex, not preference, and it bothered him. He logged into the creaking PBX console behind the office door, a beige box that stored more than it admitted. The system kept message times, not caller numbers, but it stored archived call counts and extension traces within limits. The voice message timestamp put the call at 4:21 this morning when he had been home asleep. The system marked it as external to the motel, but without a number, which meant blocked or masked through a service. He played the message once more through the PBX speaker, and this time he listened past the words to the air. There was a faint horn in the background, not a car, something long and low that cut through the compressor hum. The town had 2 train crossings, one near the elevator factory, the other near the river access by Mill Road. The factory horn sounded higher by habit, and the river crossing had a long, lonely tone that travelers remembered. He wrote train horn in the notebook, then dialed the non-emergency line and described a suspicious device in room 12. He kept the language careful and factual, and the dispatcher asked for his name, then said a unit would respond. Housekeeper Irina Kowalski stopped by the desk to clock out. 58. Quiet. A 10-year veteran of the place. She saw the detector on the counter and said she smelled glue when she changed linens, thought it came from that. He asked if she saw anyone in room 12 after checkout, and she said only a woman with a baseball cap. She had a service bucket and a ring of keys, and Irina thought she was with maintenance since she walked like staff. There were 2 maintenance guys by payroll. Neither wore caps, and neither worked Tuesdays after 3 in the afternoon. He wrote this down, then checked a clipboard of deliveries, and found a package signed by someone not on schedule. The box came yesterday morning for guest Bennett, signed by a scrawl that did not match any front desk initials. It contained a replacement smoke detector per the note, which made the blinking voicemail question feel heavier. Dorian carried the box to the office, found bubble wrap inside, plus a cutout where the detector had Saturday, tape residue stuck in a neat circle on the cardboard, and a tiny zip bag with nothing in it fell from a seam. He looked at the detector again under the desk lamp and noticed a slot behind the grill where no slot should be. He slid a paperclip in and clicked against something spring-loaded, which offered and then refused to move. The responding officer arrived while the storm thickened, and his boots left dark prints that dried like islands. He introduced himself as Deputy Holloway, 40, calm voice, and asked for the room key, the voicemail, and the timeline. Dorian played the message for him on the office speaker, and the train horn showed itself again under the words. Holloway wrote it down, then called in the serial from the detector, and the brand came back to a discount dropshipper. They walked to room 12 with the box, and Holloway took photos with a little camera that hated the low light. He gave Dorian latex gloves from his pocket, then pointed at the slot and said he would rather not break it. Dorian tried the paperclip again, this time with a little twist and a push, and the plate popped forward an inch. Inside sat something that was not a sensor, a puck with a lens barely visible and a microcard at the edge. He did not pull it, he did not touch the lens, he just looked at Holloway, whose jaw tightened for 3 beats. The deputy called dispatch and asked for a detective on call, then told Dorian to step back and breathe. The motel office had a rule about honesty with guests, which worked until honesty touched evidence and risk. Dorian printed a sign for the counter that said "Service delay for weather," and the storm covered that small necessary lie. Holloway kept the room closed and waited for the detective, while Dorian returned to the PBX to audit messages. He printed the log for the last 2 days, circled 3 external calls to room 12, all between midnight and 5. He played the first 2 messages carefully, and they were empty hang-ups, with the same horn underneath and 1 faint laugh. He resisted all guessing and wrote horn consistent in a margin, then underlined the time of the 3rd message. He checked the security drive for the hallway, and the camera caught only the tops of heads and a bit of shoulder. At 3:12 this morning, a person in a cap walked by with a tote, turned left, and vanished from frame. Dorian paused on the frame and noted the sleeve stripes, a set of 2 pale bands near the wrist. Irena had seen a cap on the woman, and the frame showed hair tucked tight, with a loose strand at the neck. Detective Renner arrived with a kit and a steady patience, a mid-40s investigator who disliked motel carpet. She listened to the voicemail twice, glanced at the detector, and asked Dorian to walk her through intake and checkout. He explained the cash payment, the request for a high floor, and the delivery for a detector that should not change. She wrote as he talked, asked about prior incidents, and he mentioned 2 privacy complaints from summer travelers. Those complaints stopped after he replaced room units from the same run, and he had kept the receipts and dates. He pulled copies from the accordion file, and she photographed them, then asked whether any rooms shared vent passageways. He described the vent layout: straight shaft between rooms in pairs, with thin walls that carried sound farther than comfort. Renner nodded and walked to room 14, asked Quinn to step into the hall, and confirmed the tapping report. Quinn described the pace like a metronome, not random: 2 taps, then a short pause, repeated until the thunder started. Renner wrote it down, and Dorian drew the pattern in a margin, then realized something he had missed earlier today. The television in room 12 was on the news channel at low volume, which travelers often used as a decoy. Some people left it on to pretend someone was inside, which meant the room might have been staged after a quick exit. Renner opened the detector with gloves and eased the card into a tiny envelope, then sealed it with her initials. She asked Dorian about any computers to view file sizes, not contents, just metadata, and he shook his head no. She used her agency laptop to check what the card held, and the screen reflected in the blank television glass. The card contained multiple files named by date and time, a standard naming scheme, which meant scheduled recording, not motion. Renner closed the laptop without opening anything and said the specifics would wait for a warrant and a lab. She asked for the guest profile again, and he gave the same summary, plus the note about the signed delivery receipt. Dorian returned to the box and saw a faint watermark in the cardboard that read "Consolidated Freight with a Town." The town sat by the river tracks where the Longhorn lived, and the company ran a warehouse near the ramp. He wrote the company down as an external lead, then called the number printed on their listing from a web search. He asked, in his perfectly polite desk voice, whether any packages left for a motel guest yesterday morning. The dispatcher said they handed 1 small box to a contractor with a name that matched no employee on file. It was recorded on their log with a time, and the signature block contained the same scrawl as his earlier photocopy. Renner thanked him for the call, took the information, and said she would handle any next contact with that company. She requested the spiral notebook from the room, and Dorian placed it in a bag, pages open to the block letters. The letters contained hotel names and highway exits, a list of routes that matched a traveler who did not like surprises. Some lines included cable channel numbers, others included lamplight wattages, and one included the word ceiling with a star. Dorian remembered a complaint from 2 weeks ago from a different guest about a beeping detector in room 5. He checked his maintenance log and found he replaced that unit on a Wednesday after a short argument about deposit charges. He fetched the old detector from the storage shelf, where broken things went to wait for disposal, and compared its weight. The broken one felt light as expected, and the one from room 12 felt like two of them taped together. He unscrewed the broken one and found no strange slot, only dust, a dead battery, and the usual brittle plastic. Renner watched from the doorway and nodded, then answered her phone, and her yes sounded like cautious confirmation. The non-emergency dispatcher had pulled two archived calls from the spring that sounded similar, not identical, but close. Each referenced a detector, each asked whether it had been moved, and both targeted rooms paid in cash and late. Renner asked Dorian to print any copies of photo identification kept on file, and he showed the log policy instead. The inn did not photocopy identification unless the card used for payment had a name mismatch or a mismatch with booking. He looked at the lobby camera track for the check-in, and the frame showed a jacket with sleeve stripes again. The face never lifted to the lens, and the cap brim hid most features, but the build matched the hallway pass. The storm eased into a steady pour, the kind that makes a street look polished, and the motel sign clicked. Renner gave Dorian a statement form and asked him to write what he did and why, as precisely as possible. He wrote that a voicemail raised a secret question about a smoke detector, which is not a thing guests ask. He wrote that the detector was wrong for the room, that its weight felt off, and that a slot existed. He wrote that a horn in the background suggested a location near the river tracks and that a freight watermark helped. He wrote that a woman with a cap carried a tote down the hall, and that tapping came through the vent. Renner finished securing the room and returned the hallway to regular use, with a note to keep room 12 closed. She told Dorian that similar devices had surfaced in short-term rentals nearby, and that his details tightened the pattern. She thanked Irena and Quinn for their help, then left with Holloway and the sealed card and the odd detector. Dorian stood in the quiet office and watched the parking lot glow under a light that had survived 4 storms this month. He made copies of everything for the file, then sat with the register and finished what he started hours earlier. The ice machine hummed to life with a stubborn cough, which felt like a small mercy after the nervous work. 2 days later, Renner called to say the voicemail mattered more than he realized because of the horn and the freight. The freight record placed a contractor truck at the warehouse near the river during the call window before dawn. She said the case would likely spread across jurisdictions and that his notes already sat in a shared folder. She did not share more, and he did not ask, because he understood the slow way these things must move to hold. Quinn checked out with a handshake and a tight thanks, and Irena started a new hallway routine that included ceiling checks. The motel added a policy line about devices, not because it fixed the world, but because it set a tone. On the next Tuesday, the phone light blinked again in a different room, and Dorian felt a breath catch. He pressed the button and heard a normal message from a family asking for extra towels, and he laughed because relief deserves sound. He still thought about the spiral notebook, about the starred word ceiling, and about the staged television glow. He thought about the simple question that did not belong, and how such questions sometimes open doors no one planned. Travelers came and went, the storm season thinned, and the parking lot felt like a stage that forgot its lines. Dorian kept the office tidy and the camera lenses clean, and he learned to trust the hairs rising on his arm.